Good morning. Esteemed colleagues, cherished students, and honored guests, thank you so much for your attendance at this morning's convocation. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Kathleen Kirsch, and I'm a professor of classics and Catholic studies here at the University of Mary. I am honored to have been selected to receive a Faculty Excellence Award from the Faculty Research Committee, and excited to be able to share with you a taste of my scholarship, which today will come from my most recent research project. What then is this project? This is going to take a little explaining, so hang with me. At the heart of a Benedictine monastic life is the Liturgy of the Hours, as you know, which is a cycle of prayers prayed at specific times of day. As a Benedictine institution, we are lucky to have the public recitation of Vespers on campus throughout the week. Now, as some of you may know, the bishops of the English-speaking world have commissioned a new translation of the Liturgy of the Hours. This is two of the four volumes of the old translation, also known as the Breviary or the Divine Office. This translation has recently been completed. One component of this liturgy is the hymn, and when the new breviary comes out, the full English translations of the proper hymns of the Latin Rite will be included for the first time. In the current edition, there are hymns, but they are not the official hymns of the Church, rather a selection of familiar English hymns. I'll bring this up a little. Although the new translation of the Liturgy of the Hours has not been published yet, the hymns have been completed and approved. They were recently published in this volume, the Divine Office Hymnal. But these hymns, many of which have been part of the prayer of the Church for over a millennium, will be new to most English-speaking Catholics. For this reason, the International Commission for English in the Liturgy decided to publish a set of commentaries on each of these hymns. These commentaries are scholarly and spiritual analyses, serving, according to the publisher's blurb, all who seek to pray the prayer of the Church with greater understanding. The first of 5 volumes was just published a month ago. The second is coming out later this year or early the next, which is where my contribution comes in. My PhD is in Greek and Latin, and my research has focused on Roman Christian poetry of the 4th century AD mostly. I was commissioned, therefore, to contribute commentaries on 2 of these hymns. So today I'll be sharing with you parts of these commentaries, focusing on exploring the depth of their formative potential, how they work to shape a Christian imaginative vision. The first thing a commentary should do is set the stage, help you understand the text in general terms. So, what is a hymn? Although the word suggests to us something unequivocally Christian, a hymnos is in fact a type of ancient Greek pagan poetry, a poetic song of praise directed towards a divinity. This genre, however, had been adopted by the Christian community in its earliest days, as attested to by a variety of passages in the New Testament. For example, in his letter to the Ephesians, St. Paul encourages the singing of hymns. Be filled with the Spirit, addressing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing and making melody to the Lord with all your heart. At the same time, the Christian community began to develop a rhythm of daily prayer outside the Sunday Eucharist. Daily Mass was not a luxury which the early church enjoyed. This rhythm assigned prayer to particular times of day. For example, St. Hippolytus tells us, if at the 3rd hour you are at home, pray and then give thanks to God. But if you chance to be abroad at that hour, make your prayer to God in your heart. At the 6th hour, likewise pray also. And at the 9th hour, let a great prayer and a great thanksgiving be made. Pray again before your bed rests on your bed. At midnight, arise, wash your hands with water, and pray. And at cockcrow, rise up and pray likewise. After the legalization of Christianity, it began to be possible for the schedule of prayer to be followed communally as well as individually, and the seeds of what would become the monastic Liturgy of the Hours were already sprouting. So, what was the content of this early Liturgy of the Hours? Well, it varied greatly from diocese to diocese, from region to region. Egeria, a 4th century Spanish pilgrim to the Holy Land, tells us that in Jerusalem, at this time, it consisted of both psalms and hymns, suggesting a combination of scriptural and later Christian compositions. The bishops of Spain, however, following the declarations of the Council of Laodicea from 363, forbade non-scriptural hymnody inside the church building. To be clear, this does not mean the bishops were condemning non-canonical hymns wholesale, just as the restriction to the proclamation of scriptural texts at Mass does not imply a condemnation of all other religious literature. In northern Italy, St. Ambrose, citing the psalmist who declares, quote, 7 times a day I praise thee for thy righteous ordinances, Psalm 119, 164, advised the consecrated virgins under his guidance, who did not live together but in their family homes, to pray the, quote, customary prayers 6 times a day, as well as reciting psalms and the Lord's Prayer during the night. So this gives us evidence of ongoing private and personal practices even as the communal and public emerged. In all these instances, however, it seems clear that sung poetry, scriptural and otherwise, was the heart of these rituals, whether in a church or at home. In some cases, the hymn might have constituted the entirety of the devotion. For example, St. Ambrose, who famously baptized St. Augustine, wrote a collection of daily hymns, one for cockcrow, one for sunrise, one for mid-morning, and one for evening, which I strongly suspect the consecrated virgins of Milan, among others, sang. About 5 years after St. Augustine entered the church, a Spanish layman quit his political career in the imperial court to dedicate himself to prayer, penance, and composing poetry. His corpus includes a set of hymns written for these 6 standard times of prayer. The man's name was Aurelius Prudentius Clemens, Prudentius as we'll call him, and his collection consisted of a hymn for cockcrow, for sunrise, before the meal, after the meal, at the lighting of the lamp, that is sunset, and before sleep. There's only one meal that Christian ascetics would eat per day, so that's why there's only one before and evening and after meal prayer. We are going to take as our case study 2 hymns of the Liturgy of the Hours, which are actually both excerpts from Prudentius's daily hymn for sunrise. Because there was no official and universal set of prayers, especially for private recitation, it seems likely that these hymns constituted the whole of the rite, and so these hymns are much longer than we might expect. The longest in the collection, ironically the one before eating dinner, is 41 verses long. If fasting until 3 p.m. doesn't give you an appetite, singing 205 lines of a hymn will. Prudentius's poetry entered the church's public liturgy in the 8th or 9th century, when a new and much expanded monastic hymnal was disseminated across Latin-speaking Europe. But because the Liturgy of the Hours includes psalms, canticles, and other prayers, Prudentius's hymns for sunrise was abridged, and 2 different hymns, only 5 stanzas in length, were excerpted from his 28-stanza original. These 2 hymns, as well as a number of other Prudentian compositions, have retained their place ever since, and to this day are found in the Benedictine, Carmelite, Norbertine, as well as the Roman breviaries. Great, so with all that in place, let's take a look at our first hymn, which is Nox et Tenebrae, a hymn assigned to morning prayer, lauds, on Wednesday in the 1st and 3rd week of the 4-week cycle, as you can see. Although, unfortunately, the actual melody that was used in the 4th century has not survived. So, what should we notice? I'd like to point out that the hymn has 2 addressees. There are 2 people we talk to. While the last 3 lines directly address Christ, the first 3 stanzas speak directly to night and darkness, clouded gloom, disturbed confusion of the world, and proclaim to these powers the arrival of Christ and the end of their sway. We command the darkness, disperse and go. It seems the visible world plays a central part in this hymn. Now, the title of this convocation promised you that I would illuminate the relationship between hymnody and the Christian imaginative vision, which is the ability to see all material creation as revelatory of spiritual realities, as charged with the grandeur of God, in the words of Gerard Manley Hopkins. First, this poem describes with care and attention the literal experience of sunrise. How does it feel to be outside in the cold and dark and to experience first the gentle warming of the sky and then the triumphant emergence of the sun? The veil of darkness torn apart is pierced by sharpened rays of sun. Clouds are rent by light. Notice the contrast between dark and light in the first verse and then between opacity and clarity in the second. This gradual development, crowned with the triumph of the sun, follows the real experience of the pallid first hints of dawn, leading through a gradually warming twilight to the glory of a sunrise. Prudentius is a man who has observed many sunrises and can share its suspense and its exhilaration with us. But as you will see, we do not pray at dawn merely because it is a pretty time to pray. In fact, even in the first stanzas, we are alerted to the fact that the natural world is a macrocosmic illustration of spiritual realities. It would be meaningless to specify that night, darkness, and clouds are of the world, unless Prudentius wished us to be aware of parallel spiritual realities. The interpretation, as we will see, will rely on an analogy between the Lord and light. Now, this comparison will probably not surprise anyone familiar with scriptural and subsequent Christian figurative language. It appears both in the Old and New Testaments. To name just a few, we have Wisdom 7:26, for she is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, and an image of his goodness. Isaiah 60:20, your sun shall no more go down, nor your moon withdraw itself, for the Lord will be your everlasting light, and your days of mourning shall be ended. Micah 7:8, rejoice not over me, O my enemy, when I fall. I shall rise when I sit in darkness. The Lord will be a light to me. Many places in the Gospel of John, including chapter 8, verse 12, again, Jesus spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life. And chapter 12, verse 46, I have come as light into the world, that whoever believes in me may not remain in darkness. As well as in the first letter of St. John, chapter 1, verse 5, this is the message we have heard from him and proclaimed to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. Saul, on the road to Damascus, experienced this metaphor to be literally true. Now, as he journeyed, he approached Damascus, and suddenly a light from heaven flashed about him, and he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. The metaphor was canonized in the Nicene Creed, which proclaims Jesus to be God from God, light from light. But Prudentius is giving this metaphor more specificity. The Lord is the light of the rising sun, and undergirding this analogy is a confidence that the visible world reliably reveals divine action, that what is cosmic and concrete can illustrate and illumine spiritual realities. So, what specifically then does observing the sunrise show us? On the one hand, it helps us to understand the significance of the incarnation for salvation history. Of course, again, this is not Prudentius's original insight. The Gospel of Matthew establishes the earthly context into which the Son of God came when he was made man as shadowy and dark. The people who sat in darkness have seen a great light, and for those sitting in the land of the shadow of death, light has arisen for them. The prologue of the Gospel of John develops this idea robustly. In him was light, and the life was the light of men, and the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Thus, the sunrise helps us to gain a feeling for the difference the incarnation makes. On the other hand, the third stanza of this slide, especially the reference to the reign of God, reminds us of Christ's second coming, which the sunrise also represents. Christ's return and the last judgment can be relied upon as much as tomorrow's sunrise. So the visible world enables us to imagine key moments in the salvation of the human race. It also teaches the Christian the overwhelming potency of God's presence in the soul. If we pay careful attention to physical and meteorological phenomena, this hymn promises, we will understand more clearly the mystic relationship between grace and sin. One layer of this allegory seems to be sacramental. Dawn can make palpable for us the transformative power of baptism. But as this is a prayer for every dawn, each morning is an opportunity once again to welcome the powerful light of Christ into our hearts. Nor should we have any doubt about God's power, the power of God's presence to transform us. One striking feature of this hymn in Latin is the tense and mood of its verbs. While many hymns are hortatory, that is, they encourage us saying, let us, optative, that is, they express desire, saying, may we, or potential, that is, expressing possibility, saying, if we, this hymn uses present and future indicatives, which communicate facts. The hymn is not telling us what might happen, but what is happening and what will happen. The dawn appears, the sky grows pale, Christ comes forth, the veil of darkness is pierced, color is restored, the darkness of our lives shall pale. In knowing you alone, O Christ, we learn to pray. As certain as are the facts that the sun will rise each morning and that where its light is shed, darkness flees, so are the facts that Christ will come again, and that when he is welcomed at baptism, at each dawn's devotion, and at the end of time, he will dispel internal darkness, no matter how grave it may seem. It is with this conviction that we pray the fifth stanza. The commands of the first two lines, look deeply, in Latin, intende, and examine closely, dispice, recall the entreaties and bold invitation of the psalmist, who in many places bids the Lord to examine his life. See, for example, Psalm 139. Prove me, O God, and know my heart. Probe me and learn my paths. But the purpose of this hymn's request is quite different from that of the psalmist here. The verse I just quoted is preceded by a rhetorical question and a confident declaration. Have I not hated those, O Lord, who hate you? And have I not been wasting away because of your enemies? I have hated them with a perfect hatred, and they have become my enemies. And it is followed by a virtual challenge. And see if the way of wickedness is within me, and lead me on the eternal life. The psalmist wishes to declare his single-hearted dedication to the Lord and asks God to look and so confirm that his heart is true. In this hymn, however, we ask the Lord to examine our hearts, knowing that he will find them tainted and deceitful. But just as the sun always rises on a darkened world, so here the divine gaze, instead of confirming purity, will effect it in its objects. The metaphor of stanzas 1 through 3 is thus consummated. As dawn does not find, but rather brings clarity to the earth, so the spiritual light of the Lord's scrutiny does not discover, but rather creates sanctity. Thus, pondering the sunrise can help the singer to open his heart to Jesus, the morning star, confident that his presence will illumine and bring joy. There's one final metaphor that's unable fully to be expressed in the English translation that I'd like to unpack for you. In the fifth stanza, we admit that in our hearts and in our lives, quote, much is tainted by deceit. How should we visualize this taint? Well, first, we think of Prudentius's description of dawn in the second and third stanzas as a paling of the sky back to its true colors. Our souls are tainted with darkness like the pre-dawn sky. But second, the Latin word fucus, here translated as deceit, is literally a red dye derived from lichens. The phrase therefore simultaneously means, quote, much is tainted by deceit and much is stained red, evoking the famous metaphor of the prophet Isaiah. If your sins are like scarlet, they will be whitened like snow, and if they are red like vermilion, they will be as wool. Finally, fucus was also used by Romans to refer to cosmetic blush, implying that the singer's soul is concealed by makeup. A third option for translating this line would be, much is coated with blush. Ancient moralizing authors, both pagan and Christian, universally condemn makeup as vain and deceptive. The cleansing and purging, therefore, also suggests wiping off a layer of cosmetics, concealing reality. Whether you prefer to imagine dawn, laundry, or a makeup wipe, your daily experience can help you appreciate what grace does. So, what can you learn from this hymn? Well, if you have any doubts about Christ's ability to dispel the darkness of your life, this is a challenge from Prudentius. Watch a sunrise. See if dawn wins or not. Watch the darkness fade and the mist evaporate. And then when you consider God's power, let your mind be fed with these images, which are but faint echoes of supernatural reality. Okay, that's one hymn. What more, you may ask, can we learn from a sunrise? Have no fear, there's plenty more. Our second hymn is Sol ecce surgit, a hymn assigned to morning prayer lauds on Thursdays in the first and third week of the cycle. In this newly published hymnal, every hymn is set both to a chant melody and to a metrical tune. So, as in the previous hymn, the first line orients readers towards the visible. The command, combined with the dramatic phrase from the Roman poet Virgil, the fiery sun, invites the reader to visualize a magnificent sunrise, or perhaps to look at it. Given that this prayer was prayed at dawn and not within the walls of the church, an eastern-facing window or a garden bench could eliminate the need for visualization. The tone of the rest of the stanza, however, contrasts strikingly with the exultant first line. It troubles, shames, and brings remorse, for no one can persist in sin when light bears witness to our guilt. Rather than celebrating and basking in the dawn of the new day, the reader is invited to experience a guilty reaction. What perspective on dawn do we have here? Instead of focusing on an allegorical interpretation of the visible world, this excerpt presents sunlight as inherently conducive to virtue and dissuasive of vice. These lines express a psychological reality. We seek to conceal what we are ashamed of, and so often hide our crimes under the cover of night. This idea figures throughout classical Latin literature, especially in love elegy, in which adultery is a prominent and recurring trope, and also finds scriptural corroboration. John 3:2 states, "For everyone who does evil hates the light and does not come to the light, so that his works may not be disclosed." In the first hymn, Prudentius led us to consider the results of sunlight in the atmosphere, in external physical reality. In these verses, we consider subjective psychological responses to dawn. If the reader has a perfectly clear conscience, well and good. He can compare himself favorably with the rest of the world as he experiences the sunrise with no pangs of guilt. But what about the reader who recognizes failings within himself, as indeed the second line suggests he will? Of course, one possibility would be to hate the light and hold out for the return of darkness. But another is to welcome the salutary impact of daylight as a deterrent. First, we can rejoice that we have day jobs and can enjoy the benefit of sunlight on our behavior. Second, and more to the point, we can ask for the grace to live a life of virtue fully under the light of the sun. And this is, in fact, what the hymn guides us to do. Notice the verbs in boldface. In Latin, these are all in the subjunctive mood, expressing exhortation, petition, and desire. This constitutes one of the most marked differences between this hymn and Nox et Tenebrae. Whereas the latter is replete with praise, the former is replete with praise, expressing confidence in divine power, this hymn is aspirational in tone, providing the reciter with his resolutions about how he will walk, speak, think, perceive, and act from now until the close of day, from early dawn to eventide, and to beseech the Lord's assistance in carrying them out. While there can be no doubt of the sun's rising or the instinctual psychological reaction to it, we who pray this hymn must beseech the Lord that we may respond appropriately. Now, you may perceive a flaw, an apparent loophole in this prayer. If the presence of the sun teaches us to avoid sin, what does this mean for night, after the sun sets? Are we released from moral obligations? By no means. First, we recall that God is omniscient. This is, of course, a tenet of Christianity, and scriptural assertions of God's omniscience are too many to count. I will cite only Hebrews 4:12-13. For the word of God is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. Neither is there any creature invisible in his sight, but all things are naked and open to his eyes. Nor does this conviction remain in the sphere of the notional. The hymn's description of God's omniscience in stanza 5, the one who sees stands by on high and watches us throughout our days, discerning every act and deed from early dawn to eventide, directs our attention to the sky and the sun with the phrase on high. Just as the sun makes clear what could not be perceived before dawn, so God illumines what the heart had thought was concealed. And as noted earlier, the appropriate response to the literal dawn, as well as to our awareness of God as the all-seeing Sun of righteousness, is to aspire to live a life of virtue. Finally, while pagan and especially Pythagorean conceptions of the sun god Helios as an all-seeing divinity are sobering, perhaps even frightening, for the Christian, God's omniscience, of which the sun reminds us, is a source of joy. For authentically Christian repentance always becomes an occasion for rejoicing. The hymn's second development of the association between daylight and moral behavior is to overlay the literal daytime with two symbolic ones. On the one hand, in stanza 4, the reader renounces sin for all the day, which, as stanza 5 indicates, is both this particular day, from early dawn to eventide, and his whole life, all our days. That is to say, the whole of Christian life is a day. Again, this idea has strong scriptural support. See, for example, John 9:4. I must do the works of him who sent me as long as it is day. And Psalm 129:6. From the morning watch even till night, let Israel hope in the Lord. On the other hand, many scholars have perceived an orientation towards the end times in this hymn. While we often think of Christ's second coming as the last days, it is also the ultimate dawn. As St. Paul's letter to the Roman puts it, the night is far gone, the day is at hand. So then let us cast off the works of darkness and put on the armor of light. Let us walk properly as in the daytime. The reader is urged, therefore, to live life in such a way that neither God's omniscience nor Christ's second coming disturbs him, as dawn unnerves those engaged in shady, furtive deeds. As we have said, Prudentius's careful observation of the natural world leads him to two theological interpretations. In Nox et Tenebrae, light as a physical and meteorological phenomenon presents an image of sin and grace. In Sol ecce surgit, the psychological impact of light is considered. In the former, God is asked to examine the heart so that his gaze may effect purification, just as the sun effects enlightenment. In the latter, the reader is reminded of his own inclination to sin and is urged to embrace light as a deterrent. Furthermore, we see that the symbolism of the sun and sunrise is not some loose mind association, something like the sun rises, Jesus rose from the dead, so Jesus is like the sun, right? But posits a real connection between dawn and divine realities. The person who sings these verses for sunrise is thus prompted to observe dawn carefully. The visible process and the natural human reactions thereto become not simply powerful metaphors for, but keys to unlocking invisible reality. Prudentius's morning hymn, therefore, does not draw his reader away from lived experience, but into a rich reading of it, assuring us that creation reveals something of the Creator. Now, my in-depth analysis of two of the hymns of the Liturgy of the Hours cannot simplistically be generalized to all almost 300 of these hymns, written by a vast number of authors in perhaps every century from the 4th to the 20th. But my hope is that it is now evident that the rhythm of the divine office, which appoints specific prayers for specific times of day, aims not only to fill the whole day with prayer, but also to form the imagination as it discerns symbolic meaning in invisible reality. As the Nicene Creed, the 1700th anniversary of which we will celebrate this summer, asserts, God is creator of all things visible and invisible. If we reject theological voluntarism, then we must also conclude that creation speaks, albeit by analogy, of God. Visible reality is not dissonant with invisible reality. And so, although these hymns are not now familiar elements of Catholic spirituality, it is my hope that an appreciation will grow of their contribution to the liturgy, not as merely ornamental warm-ups to the real content of Scripture, but profoundly effective instruments for the formation of a Christian Catholic sacramental approach to seeing reality. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Please.
A couple things. The first is just a comment. What I found interesting about the first hymn, the metaphor in the first hymn was the sun annihilates the night, but does it gently and effortlessly, right? There seems to be, maybe I'm overinterpreting it, but there seems to be this feel that Christ, his victory is assured, but also that his victory is gentle somehow, right? Like the night sort of like gladly succumbs, right, to the dawn. I might be overinterpreting it, but...
I mean, we say, like, get the heck out of here to night and darkness. So I don't know how gentle it is, but it's effortless, I would agree.
Yeah,
yes.
okay.
Yeah.
The question I had, it might be kind of a letdown, but you... So, assuming that you know...
Set my expectations low.
Assuming that you know Greek better than I do, what in the world is the difference between a hymn and a spiritual song?
This is a great question, and I don't know the answer to this. And I sort of maybe over-distinguished here, but for example, St. John Cassian, when he's talking about the monks in the desert, says that they pray hymni matutini, so morning hymns, but then describes them as psalms. So the barriers, the boundaries of what is a psalm, what is a spiritual song, what is a hymn, I don't think it's as clear as one would like. Yeah, so that is a non-answer.
So you have persuaded me that these are very interesting poems, and I would like to hear more about like the role of the editor in these. So like in your boy's enormously long poem, are these all like distinct, clearly demarcated chunks? Are these like synthetic bits that have been put together from like verses from all over? Like what's the relationship there?
You mean the current version, or
like the two chunks that
yes,
we see,
yep.
like are they just chunks that exist in the very long version, or is it like there's a verse from here and a verse from here and a verse from the last part?
Yeah, so the first hymn is basically 4 verses that are chunked together and one from the very end. And then I said there were 5 stanzas, and then you may have noticed there were 6, but the 6th one was a medieval doxology that's composed, so it's not pretentious, hence I don't talk about it. So nothing against doxologies, it's just not part of this poem. So that one is a pretty coherent one. The other one, Sol ecce surgit, takes maybe about the 6th verse and then lines like 94 to 106 and a couple of others. How they got here, they're pretty close to the versions that were used in the 9th century. Then in the Renaissance, people decided they wanted to improve them according to their own standards of Latin, so they were edited, and the current versions have been restored to their ancient varieties. There are huge sections, obviously, of this poem, 28 stanzas, leaves over half missing, but yeah, there's a lot. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Just a quick follow-up
Please.
to something you just said.
Yeah.
Is Prudentius not good at Latin?
He's very good, but for example, they changed the first line from Sol Ineus, the fiery sun, to Lux Aurea, the golden light, because I think at that time they wanted to sort of focus on the spiritual interpretation and less on the visible, and they edit out more of the references to an actual sunrise. There were other people in the Middle Ages whose Latin does not conform to classical standards, shall we say. So the Renaissance editors wanted their prosody to be more correct, so that they corrected a lot of these hymns. Yeah.
I'm of the understanding that the Liturgy of the Hours also has its roots way back in the Jewish practice of prayer at set times of the day.
Yes, and in the Acts of the Apostles, we hear, Peter and John went to the temple to pray at the 3rd hour. So St. Hippolytus' description of praying at the 3rd hour and the 9th hour and 6th hour certainly is related to that. I don't think that the content of those prayers is related specifically to this hymn, but you are very right to point out that, yes, the Christian practice was building on an earlier Jewish practice. Thank you, sister.
So are these two sections of Prudentius the only parts of his hymns that are in the Liturgy of the Hours? They don't use any of his evening hymns or anything like that?
No, they use his hymn for cockcrow, his evening hymns. They use his hymn, one of his hymns for the feast of the Holy Innocents, for the feast of Saint Lawrence, for one of the random all martyrs hymns is from his hymn to Saint Vincent, because the name Vincent means victor, and so you can use it for any victorious martyr, right? It doesn't have to be Vincent. So that's one of the options, and there are others. Yeah. Any other questions? Dan, back to you.
I'll always have more. This is actually the question closest to my heart, though it almost certainly will be a letdown. Where is this?
I don't know.
You didn't take this picture.
I didn't take
Okay.
this picture. No, I did the Camino de Santiago, and I have some images of really beautiful sunrises as I was hiking up mountains, but my camera and photography skills are not equal to the beauty of the sunrise. So this is representative of that experience, which was in Spain, and so I've seen Spanish sunrises even, but it isn't, as far as I know.
Okay, on a
authentic.
somewhat more serious note, just judging from the subtitle on the cover of the book, of the commentary, what did it say? It said something like, was it Lent, Advent, Christmas, and Easter? Mm-hmm. Isn't that almost what's left?
So volume 2 will be the ordinary time, and then I think 3 through 5 will be all the saints. So
Okay.
saint days.
So particular saints' days, many of which are in ordinary time, but don't fall.
But
in
are
that.
not part of
Okay.
the ordinary cycle of hymns.
I see.
Yes. Thank you all for your attention.